About 3 days ago, I switched from using DWM, the Dynamic Window Manager, to xmonad. And I wanted to go through setting up xmonad if you're coming across from i3 or DWM, and some of the reasons why you might want to switch. Basically, DWM is a program written by the Suckless guys who have a philosophy of writing programs with a minimal amount of code. Problem is, DWM actually lacks some features you'd find in a normal tiling window manager, and what you have to do is actually patch the source code, and there's loads of different patches that add different functionality. Problem is basically you're installing something with a minimal amount of code and then having to apply loads of patches to actually get some functionality. And you've got no idea who's written these patches or how well they're written, or if the patches will actually work with other patches that you might have installed. And one of the problems I noticed with DWM was actually when I was switching windows, I'd get a lot of tearing, and it would kind of combine two windows into one. So if I switched from this window to another window, it would kind of draw them both on the screen at the same time. So what I did was switch to xmonad, and on the day I switched to xmonad, there's a guy called DT who's got a channel called distrotube, and he basically made a video about you recently left i3 and moved to DWM, carry on to xmonad, and this was in a response to a video by another guy called Luke Smith who was saying, yeah, you should all be using DWM. And if you search for xmonad on YouTube, most of the videos you'll come across are by DT. He's been using it for about 10 years and knows a lot more about it than I do. But I think there were a few things that he actually missed out in configuring xmonad that I wanted to cover. Basically, what I'm going to do now is come across and show you what I've got set up with xmonad so far. This is a full screen window. You can see here we have a bar which is showing the workspaces, the layout and the number of windows and the application. And this is actually DT's xmobar configuration that I've used, because that's the one I sort of came across, and we've got the date and time across here. And it's actually, there's a couple of things you need to set up with xmobar, which I came across. This wasn't showing when I first set it up. It kept saying updating. But what I'm going to do now is go through a couple of the window layouts. So if I press, when you configure xmonad, which I'll get into in a second, you have certain key bindings that can switch through the layouts that you've got installed. So this is a full screen layout with a bar. I can now switch to the second layout I've got, which is a sort of tiling layout like this. And what I've also set this up to do is to be able to resize these are the this is called the master, and this is basically the stack. So you have like your master window over here on the left, and then you can create new windows and they sort of appear in the stack. So if I just move this across, you'll see as I'm moving the mouse across, you're getting a little board around here which shows the active window. And you can also use keyboard shortcuts for this. So if I press, basically when you set up DWM, by default it will use the Alt key as the modifier to manage windows and stuff, but most people change that to the super key or the Windows key or the command key on the Mac. And if I press the super key or the mod key and then press K, you can see it's highlighted this window. So if I go mod key J and K, you can see it's moving through these windows here, and that lets you basically select the different windows, and you can basically have a board around the window to indicate the window that has got focus. In this layout, what you can also do is hold down the mod key super key or the Windows key, and press L to increase the size of the master pane, or H to decrease the size. If I come across to one of these windows now and just put something in there, what I've set this up to do, you can see up here this is describing the name of the layout, and it's basically spacing resizeable tool. So what that means is it's a tool layout which has got spaces around it, and the resizable bit actually applies to these windows. And what I've done is you can set up, you can sort of import different libraries into xmonad that provide different functionality, and then define keyboard shortcuts to execute that functionality on a window. So for instance, if I press mod A, you can see that's increasing the size of this window here. I've got this window selected. If I press mod A, that's increasing the size of the lower window. If I press mod Z, you can see it's increasing the size of this window and shortening the window below. Now, if I've got this window here selected, which you can either do by moving your mouse or mod J and K to move up and down. If I then press mod A, you can see it's increasing the size, and mod Z is decreasing the size. And I find that's quite a useful thing to have, because frequently you might want to have a tall window here and a slightly smaller one there. And say by default what it will do is it will, if I kill one of these windows, to close the window, what you do is shift mod C, and that's kill the window. If I now press shift mod return or enter, you can see it's created a sort of new window. And say what will happen by default is that these will be set to divide the screen evenly, so that you get two windows even here. Using the resizable tool Haskell library that you import into xmonad, you can actually set this up so you can actually increase and decrease the size of these stack windows, which is quite useful. The next layout that I've got is a grid layout, and to shift to the next layout I'm going to hold down mod and press space, and you can see here the layout's changed to space and grid. But you can see here it's not actually changed anything in the layout, and the reason is we've only got 3 here. So if I add another window, terminal window, by pressing shift mod enter, you'll see it's now got a sort of grid layout, and I can carry on doing that, and it will change the layout back to, it will increase the amount of windows in the grid, and I can control shift mod C to kill these windows. And if you want to, you basically cycle through the windows using mod space. You do also have the ability to set up certain key bindings to automatically switch to a particular layout, but I haven't got into that yet. So that's the next layout I was using, was a grid layout. And I'm just going to kill these windows here. So I've only got one window, and the next layout I've got is a full screen layout. So if I press mod space, you can see now that the window has gone full screen, and it has also removed the bar at the top. And the reason you want to do this is because if you're playing a video, basically you want that to go full screen. Let me see if I've got one of my videos. Let's see, where did I have? Let me just quickly go through. Yeah, I'll show you what I mean. So you can see here now this has gone full screen. You can see I was actually recording this in DWM, but you can see the video has gone full screen, so you don't, because otherwise it would still have the bar at the top. If I go back to the original layout, if I press mod space, it'll cycle through to the next item in the layout, or I can press shift mod space to go back to the first. That will go back to the default, and you can see here we've got the bar. And if I play the video again and close it, you can see that the video isn't actually full screen because we've still got the bar. So if I then cycle through the layouts, you'll see it's now full screen. So those are the three basic layouts I've gone for. Sort of full screen layout, a resizable tiling layout, a grid layout, and a full screen layout without a bar. So what I'm going to do is go in and show you how you can configure some of this. The other thing I've done is DWM has functionality where you can set a window to appear on multiple workspaces. So for instance, if I come across, you can see here we've got the browser open. You can actually set this window to appear on all these workspaces at once. So if I press the keyboard shortcuts I've defined for this, I think it was Shift Control A. You can see now that all these workspaces have got a plus next to them, and that's something I've set up in the xmobar config, so that it will basically show when a workspace has got a window on it. If I now switch across to all these windows here, you can see they're all sort of full screen. But if I toggle that, you can see that's on all the workspaces at once. And if I press the keyboard shortcut I've defined to remove the window from all the workspaces, is Shift Control Z, and I believe that should now just be on this window. So originally it was on workspace 3, and now it's been removed from all the workspaces and it's just on this workspace. I can move this to another workspace by pressing the mod key and Shift and 3. So you can see that's now been moved across. So basically what I'm going to do is go through some of the things you need to actually set up with xmonad to get it working, and what you need to install. If I come across to some of my notes, I'm using FreeBSD here. And on FreeBSD, the package names aren't actually xmonad. They're prefixed by HS, which is Haskell. So on FreeBSD, a lot of the package names aren't the same as you'd think they would be. So say when we're installing xmonad on FreeBSD, you'd be installing hs-xmonad, and the other thing that you'd be wanting to install is the xmonad contrib, which adds additional layouts that you can use, and the other thing that would be installing would be xmobar, which on FreeBSD is hs-xmobar. On Linux, I think they're just called it's xmonad, but xmonad contrib is called, it's got a slightly different name. It's something like GHC xmonad lib contrib or something. But if you do an app search xmonad, it should come up in the results. Now the other thing is that xmonad has a default configuration file, and so does xmobar, and basically the way to find the location of that default configuration file on your system I just come across and switch back to normal. As root, so I'm using doas, but normally if you're on Linux you'd be using sudo. We do doas and run the find command, find root directory name, and then xmonad. So you can see it's called, the configuration file is called xmonad.hs. So if you run as root, find /-name xmonad.hs, give it a minute or so and it will return the location of the default configuration file for xmonad on your system. And you're going to want to do the same thing to find the xmobar config. Now the next step is to actually create the directory that xmonad and xmobar are going to use for their configuration files, and the default directory is xmonad. So in your home directory, what you want to do is create the .xmonad directory, and then basically you would add your configuration file in there. It may be a good idea to actually have a base configuration file in the xmonad directory before you try and start up xmonad, because by default xmonad just comes up with a blank screen, which is a bit confusing. The other thing that you need to do to set up xmobar is to create a config in your config directory you need to create xmobar, and in there in the xmobar config xmobar directory, we're going to have a xmobar rc file. So what we're going to do is actually create the directories, add the configuration files, and we need to also edit our xinitrc file to execute xmonad when we run startx. If you're not using startx, you use a graphical, display manager, login manager, whatever, you have to set it up slightly differently, and there'll be documentation on that. But if I come across to this, just close this and find where I had have a look at my xinitrc file. At the bottom here you'll see what I'm doing is running exe and then shush agent, and the reason I do this is because this will start the shush agent on your computer when you log in to xmonad, and then what you do with shush is you then sort of add your key, and it will keep your shush key in memory for that session. So by default I always run shush agent and then the path to xmonad, and you can find the actual path where xmonad is installed by where is xmonad. Okay, and you can see the location of the xmonad binary is user local bin xmonad on my system. So we've set up our xinitrc, and what we need to do is actually copy a config file for xmobar and xmonad into the proper directories, so that when we log out of our current window manager and then start xmonad, it's not a completely blank screen. So what I'm going to do is come across and basically what I did was DT has actually got his xmonad configuration file on GitLab. So if you do a search for distrotube gitlab, you'll then find his dot files, and in the xmonad directory is his xmonad.hs file, which is where I got some of the setup that I'm using, and also the xmobar file. So if I come into his config directory and xmobar, and basically he's actually got 3 xmobars set up because he has 3 monitors. But I was just going to open the first one here, and what I'll then do is compare it to the one I've got set up, because I just have the date and time. You can add things like your network and disk space and your IP address and all that kind of stuff, but I don't need that, so I don't include that. So there is one thing I found about setting up xmobar. If I come across to my xmobar config, first of all, well, maybe I should actually start, instead of going into xmobar, I'll start with xmonad. But while I'm on this, the one thing that I did come across with xmobar, while I remember it, is when I first set it up, I had the date and time, but it wasn't showing any of my workspaces. It was just saying updating, and I couldn't figure out why that was. And basically what it is xmobar sort of runs on standard in and standard out, and you actually had to put in run stdin reader, and once I've done that, this section displaying the workspaces showed up. But what I'm going to do is come across to my xmonad config file, and what I should do also is actually show you the default xmonad config file, which actually can be a bit confusing. So first of all, what I did was I actually just copied the default xmonad config file and sort of tried hacking on it, but it was quite difficult to sort of to do that. So I found it easier to sort of kind of start from scratch and gradually put stuff in. The default, if I can come across, bear with me when oh, for fuck's sake, I hate drop down menus. It's just all my notes on stuff. I've come across to xmonad default, and this was the default xmonad configuration file on my system. And basically it sort of starts off, the way xmonad sort of works is you kind of import different libraries, which then give you particular functionality in the window manager. So this is the default config file, and basically you're importing, this is the basic setup that it comes with, importing these different libraries, and then you can go through and define particular variables to override the defaults. So like setting, you know, my terminal, or the border width around Windows, or the key that's used, the mod mask key, which is used to switch windows, and which by default will be the alt key. Mod 1 mask means the alt key. What we'll do is we'd change this to mod 4 mask, which would be the super key. So this is the sort of default configuration file in xmonad, and it basically, what it does is it has all these default key bindings for you know, switching windows and stuff. And what you can do is actually just override the ones you want to. So what xmonad will do is it'll sort of use all these defaults in your setup unless you override them. And this myKeys setup is actually quite difficult to understand, to sort of make head or tail of how it's launching stuff and what keys it's actually using. And there's actually a library that you can install that makes it easier to define your own key bindings, which I'll go into. So these are sort of the default key bindings, and then it sort of has sort of a default mouse bindings, and basically it comes with sort of by default the layouts that you'll get will be three layouts, which would be a tiled layout, which is sort of like the one I showed you before. We have the master on the left and you have the stack on the right, and then mirrored tiled, and basically what that is you'd have one window here sort of occupying half the screen, and then the stack would be below it, but I wasn't very keen on that. And then the third default layout would be tiled, and basically the order that's defined here is the order of the layouts that you're going to get. So whenever you create a new window, by default it's going to use the first layout defined here. Now I didn't want the tiled layout by default. I wanted a full window layout, so I'll go through and show you how I set that up. The next section, which I haven't really got into, is window rules, and this basically allows you to set particular windows to have particular attributes like floating or not floating, and there's a way. And what you do basically, if you come across here in the terminal, what you run is a program called xprop. So if I come across to the terminal here, and I'll just run xprop. If I just run xprop here and press return, this is not doing anything. But if I then click on this window, what you can see here is that it's actually giving us information about the Windows class name and the actual name, you know, of it has like several different kind of names. It has like a class name and a sort of title name and other stuff, and you can see it's all set to urxvt, which is the name of my terminal. If I did this with, say, if I switched across here and did this on Firefox, xprop, and then selected the window, you'll see here that it's actually sort of giving the name of the window, and what you can do is use this to specify how it should behave with different layouts like floating and stuff. What I've been trying to do is get the picture-in-picture window in Firefox to automatically float and float a specific size, but I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. I'll skip over the event handling and these sections here, but myStartupHook, this is basically when xmonad starts, you can actually set it to start particular programs, like for instance Fey or Nitrogen, to set your background wallpaper, start a shell, start different programs, and then you have the sort of the main section, which is kind of like a main loop, and basically what you have in this is you have your sort of variables that you're sort of overriding. So you can see here terminal, my terminal. Basically, if we came back up to the top, you can see it's not, by default it's going to set it to xterm, and so what it's doing is you kind of set these variables, and in the if I come back down to the main section, it then uses the variables that you've set to set up xmonad. So that's the default config file, and what I'll do now is actually go through the changes that I've made to my config file, kind of using the default and a combination of some of DT's stuff. So you can see here, one of the first things I've imported is the xmonad config desktop, and this is a library that is supposed to make it xmonad more compatible with desktop applications like browsers. So that's something you want to put in. The next section here, this you see if you look at the naming of these libraries, they're all like named xmonad util or hooks or actions or layout. So kind of good practice to separate these out so that you're not mixing the utils with the systems and the hooks. It just makes it easier to go through and see what you put in there. So this system, this import sys.io hput string length. This is basically used with xmobar. So this is basically, I think it's sort of kind of like taking standard and standing out and running it into xmobar. So that's basically what that's for. Then we've got these utils here, these utilities, and we've got this run, which I think is again used for the xmobar setup, and spawn once is something I believe from the setup is how you kind of spawn an application. The next thing you're going to want to install, which is the xmonad util easy config, which lets you define additional keys and additional mouse bindings, but in a more user-friendly syntax. It's a syntax that's almost a bit like Emacs in the way you define keyboard shortcuts for Emacs. Now the next section is the hooks. Again, I think the dynamic log is for xmobar. Now the manage docs is from library, is a library that I think was something that will basically lets you manage how the window interacts with the bar. So it kind of lets you sort of let me sort of go full screen and overlap the bar. And we've then got this EHW desktops, and this is another desktop config that's supposed to make it easier, and also it means that xmonad can work with OBS Studio, I believe. I think you need that to work with OBS Studio. And then you've got this next thing, which is manage helpers, and this I believe kind of provides some functionality to determine what kind of window is running. Is it full screen? Is it a dialogue window? Now the next section was place, and with this kind of lets you, I think, sort of change the sort of the border and stuff. You see, when I'm in, by default, when I open a new window, it's going to be in full screen mode with a bar, because I've set that with my sort of my layout. But you can see it's got no border around it. Whereas if I shift to the tiling layout, you can see that the window has got a border around it. So this allows you to kind of be like sort of set smart borders so that your full screen windows don't have a border, but your tiling windows do. And I set the full screen window to be the default layout because I don't want a, by default, I've also set gaps here. You can see I've got spacing around this. By default, I want my window to be like that. If there's only one window, I don't want a gap and I don't want a border. But if I'm in tiling mode, I want gaps and a border. You can see this window has focus and it has a coloured border around it. If I press Mod and J and it shifts to the other window focuses on the other window, it's now got a border on it, and you can also see that the window name here is then visible in the xmobar sort of status. So by default, I say I don't want a border and spacing on a full screen window. I want it in tiled mode. Let's shift back there. Now this next section here, this actions xmonad copy window, that's what I use to kind of emulate the DWM functionality of tagging a window and having it on multiple workspaces at once. And the reason that's very useful is because if you're playing a video, for instance, and you want to have it show up on all your workspaces, you can do that, and I'll go through and show you the keyboard configuration shortcuts to do that. Basically, at the moment, I've got it set up so that I can tag a window to appear on all the workspaces at once, and sort of have another keyboard shortcut that moves them, except for removes all the other copies from all the other all the other workspaces. DWM has functionality that will allow you to tag a window for a particular workspace, and that should be possible with the copy window library. So that, for instance, you could just say, okay, tag this window so it appears on workspace 2 and 1, but I haven't quite figured the syntax out for that as yet. But switching from DWM to xmonad, that was kind of one of the things that I wanted to replicate. Now the next section down here is the actual layout. These are the additional libraries that I've imported to give me different window layouts and spacing and sort of borders. So one of the things we've got here, the first one, is the no borders library, and this basically allows you to set particular layouts so they don't have a border. So for instance, this window here, I don't want a border when there's just one window. Also, if this window was full screen like this and it was a video, I wouldn't want a border around this particular window. So that's why we import the no borders library. The next library I'm going to import is the spacing library, and that's basically if I switch to the tiling mode by pressing mod space, the spacing library is what allows me to create spaces between the windows. For many years I didn't actually use spacing, and I've only just recently tried it out, and it's a hell of a lot easier to see what window you're on, because I was a lot of the time using sort of DWM without spaces or i3 without spaces. It would be quite awkward to see which window you actually had selected. So it is actually it looks nice, and it is also actually quite useful to be able to see at a glance which window you've got selected. And I'll go back to the main mode. So that's why that's the spacing library. The next one is the grid library that I've imported that sets the grid layout I showed you. The next layout is the resizeable tile layout, and that's the layout that that's the library that lets you adjust the tiled layout. So as I showed you before, I could adjust the height of the windows in the stack, so I could make them bigger or smaller, and that's the library we use to set that. The next section is the actual config file, the config variables that we're going to set. The most important one is my mod mask, and by default that's going to be mod 1 mask, which would be alt. So you're going to want to set the mod mask to mod 4 mask, which will be the super key, the Windows key, the command key on the Mac. the next thing you're going to do is define your terminal. And I'm actually using urxvt, and you can see I've actually got this set to urxvt-c, and that's the client, because as you can see down here in myStartupHook, which is the where you start up applications when xmonad starts, I've set this to spawn once urxvt-d and what that does is that starts the urxvt daemon in the background, and then we use the urxvt-c client to connect to the daemon. And what this does is it makes it much faster, because you just have sort of like the one daemon going for the terminal, and then you have clients that connect to it. It makes it much faster. And I'm just going to switch off and mention something about urxvt, which is how to actually set internal padding on urxvt and improve some of the font rendering. I recently tried using ST and the ST terminal and Alacrity. The ST terminal is kind of crippled, really. It's kind of it's a suckless program. You've got to kind of compile it yourself and patch it and make all these changes. By default, it doesn't have scroll back in it, and also by default it will set the shell that you use in the terminal, and by default it will set it to the Bourne shell bin sh, so that you actually have to edit the ST terminal code and change that to the shell you want to launch. I also tried Alacrity, which is, like, supposed to be this super fast GPU rendered terminal, and what I found is opening 3 Alacrity Windows terminals used up 6% of my CPU versus 0.2% with urxvt with 3 Windows. So I don't use Alacrity, but what I want to do is actually show you how to set an internal kind of padding with urxvt. So if I come across to these windows here, you can see this text here isn't butted right up against the side of the window. Like if I put this into full screen, you can see there's actually padding around this, and it's not right up against the screen. And the way you do that, if I come across to my X resources, okay, the other thing about urxvt that I found is, at least on FreeBSD, urxvt's term name is urxvt, and it was only giving me it wasn't letting, if I set the term name to urxvt 256 colors, I had issues. So what I'm doing is I'm setting the urxvt term name to xterm 256 color in my x resources file, as opposed to in my shell config file, my zsh or bashrc file, setting the term name, because doing it this way only affects the term name of the urxv terminal, whereas if you set the term name in your shell config file, it will apply system wide. So setting the urxvt term name to xterm 256 color gives me 256 color in urxvt. Now the section I actually wanted to mention here for urxvt was the internal border. So that's urxvt.internal border, and I've got it set to 4 pixels. So that's how you can create a border with urxvt. And once you change that in your X resources file, you would run xrdb X resources to apply those changes. But it was just me getting sidetracked about terminals. So that's how you set the terminal name. The next section is my border width, and that's the width of the border around the currently focused window. So if I switch this to tiled mode, you can see here that I've got a 2 pixel border set round this window. Come on, close that out. So we've got the border width, and we've got my normal border color, and then my focused border color. And the difference between these is, if I switch across here, you can see this is the focused window, and this is the unfocused. Well, the one on the right is the unfocused window, and you can see they've got different colors, and that's how you define that. So my normal border is an unfocused window, whereas my focused border color is the window with focus. Now these sections down here are actually for the xmobar config from DT. I've altered his config slightly, where he had the colors sort of hard coded into the block of code. So what I've done is I've actually, apart from one color which I couldn't figure out to change, is I've replaced those with variables that you can set up here. So these sections here, like my current, visible, hidden, these are what defines these colors. So you can see, like my current, that's this number 3, and then we have we've got the current workspace, and then we also have workspaces that have windows on them but aren't visible, and then we have workspaces that aren't in focus and don't have any windows on them. So that's what we've got, like my current, my visible, hidden, and hidden no windows. And then we can sort of define the title and sort of the color of urgent windows. The next thing here is got my workspaces, and this corresponds to the list of workspaces up here. Now you can change these so that it says, you know, like www and text editor and video and dev and whatever, and those names will show up there. But personally, I just keep them as numbers, because I might not always have Firefox open on a particular workspace, or I might not have decided ahead of time which window I'm going to have on which workspace. And also I find it actually makes it more difficult to switch workspaces. You can see, I want to switch to workspace 4 or 5, where if you've got text in there, you kind of got to go, okay, 1 2 3 4 5, and count the numbers, and then execute the keyboard shortcut. But that's just a personal thing. This window count variable here is again from DT's xmobar config, and that's basically what's setting the that's how we get the number of windows that actually have applications open on them, and which is the currently focused window. Again down here we have the myStartupHook, and this again is how you start up applications when xmonad starts. So for instance, as I said, I'm using it to start the urxvt daemon for my terminal, and this is how I'm setting my background wallpaper. So that's how I'm setting this wallpaper by using this block of code here, which is running Fay, and basically setting a color and the image that I'm going to use. Now the next section here is the actual layouts, and this is the layouts that you're going to use in the order that they're going to appear when you sort of cycle through them. What I've done here is I'm using this library avoid struts, and basically what this does is this sets it so that these particular windows don't overlap this bar. So what this is basically saying is the windows between here, these particular styles, will never overlap the bar. But the last layout here, you can see these three vertical lines, and monocle. This is the full screen layout. So that's basically allowed to avoid struts and override the bar so that it goes full screen. So for instance, if you want to play a game or you want to watch a video, that will set it so that the window is full screen, no bar, no spacing, no borders, that sort of stuff. So first of all, monocle, when I've got that down here, is monocle equals smart borders full. And basically, as I said, that will set it. So this is the full screen layout here, which monocle is monocle here. And that's the full screen layout with smart borders. So that basically removes the borders on this particular layout. Now the next layout here is the tiled layout, which corresponds to this section down here. And here you can see we have spacing 12, and that is the space between the windows. Okay, so that's the space between the windows. So you can adjust that, increase it, reduce it to whatever you want. Then we have the $ resizeable tool, and this again is the this particular layout where I can by pressing the mod key and A or Z, I can increase or decrease the size of these stack windows. I can resize them. So that's the resizable tool, and this basically is kind of what makes it sort of work. So that was the tiled layout, so that's the monocle, the tiled, and then we have the grid. Again, we're setting the grid 12 spacing and 16 by 10, which I think is the maybe the grid size. And again, the monocle layout here, this is the next one, smart borders full. So these three here will all not overlap the bar, but this one here will be true full screen without bars, padding or anything. And again, we're using the smart borders so that it doesn't have any sort of borders. And this is the default number of windows in the master pane. So when you're in the master and stack view is going to have only one master, but there is actually a sort of shortcut, keyboard shortcuts I think you can use to increase or decrease the amount of windows in the master. The next section is the ratio, and that's basically the ratio of the master window to the size of the stack window. So as you can see here, this is by default set to 50%. So by default, the master is going to occupy 50% of the window and the stack is 50%. And again, you can use keyboard shortcuts while you're in the master and stack view to increase or decrease the size. So if I press mod and L, you can see it's increasing the size of the master, or H to decrease it. But you can also set the default ratio here, and this is the percentage to increase or decrease the panes when you're doing a keyboard shortcut I just showed you. Now the next section is the window rules, and these are sort of rules that basically should apply to particular windows. So like for instance MPV or GIMP. And what I've been trying to do is actually figure out how to set MPV to open at the correct size, because by default, if I open I'll close these and open a video, okay. What I mean is, when I open the window in tiled mode, what's going to happen is it's going to display the video like this. It's going to center the video here with black bars above and below it. And what I really want is it it to be up here with no black bars. What you can actually do is using a mouse. I think you can, if I press the mod key and the left mouse key, it sort of goes into a floating window. And if I hold the mod key and the right mouse key, I can sort of resize it. See? Now to move the window, if you hold the mod key, you can then drag it. Basically, by default, what I'd like to have is the video to open like this as a floating window. But as yet, I haven't quite figured out how to do that. But I just thought I'd sort of mention, you know, that's one issue I've come across. And I've been looking at this direct float, but I haven't figured out how to do that. The other thing that I've been trying to figure out is the Firefox picture-in-picture window. And if you use xprop in the terminal and select a picture-in-picture window that's sort of been tiled, it will return the property name of the window will be picture-in-picture. So it should be possible to target that window and then kind of like apply some rules to have it automatically float. But what I found is if I open one of these, well, I can't, if I open it, just pause it. If I press the picture-in-picture, if I'm in full screen mode, what's going to happen is this is going to go full screen. Yeah, you can see it on full screen. If I switch to a tiling layout and then do the picture-in-picture, you can see now that it's appeared as a tile. I could sort of, you know, alt, press the mod key and then sort of do that to sort of resize it and stuff. But I'd kind of like to not have to do that every time I open a picture-in-picture window. So I switch back to sort of normal mode. So that's one issue I've had with picture-in-picture, and it may just be something I've done or not done in my configuration file that's causing that issue. But what I found, as I say, is that picture-in-picture for me isn't working the way it should do, and there must be something I'm missing or have to do to get that working. And so I'm not quite sure what that is at the moment. Now this next section here, this is how you can define your keys. And what we did up here, we imported the xmonad util easy config additional keys and additional mouse bindings. If I come down here to my keys, I think I had the default. I think this is the default thing. Let me just see if I can find the section with myKeys. Okay, so by default, you sort of define the keys like this, which is not very intuitive. So you can use the easy config library to configure key bindings with a different sort of syntax, which is easier to understand. So for instance, window copy to all, this is S and C, that's shift and control and A. So shift control A will copy this window to all the workspaces, and shift control Z will kill all the other copies of the window on the other workspaces. Now this one here is M, and that's the mod key, which would be the super key, the command key, the Windows key, A. So this is how we're shrinking and expanding the stack in the resizeable tile. So that's how, if I just open up some windows, if I do the mod key, if I shift across using mod J, if I do mod A or mod Z, that's how we resize those stack windows by using that keyboard shortcut. So that's shift and control would be capital S and capital C, and the mod key would be capital M. And it's just a lot easier to sort of define keys like that rather than the default way that xmonad does. Now the next section is the main section. This is kind of like the kind of main loop that xmonad goes through to sort of launch stuff and set stuff up. And first of all, what we have here is this is how we are launching xmobar. So we're doing xmp roc, sort of left arrow, spawn pipe, and then the path to xmobar. And this is actually how you can set it to appear on multiple, which monitor you want to have it appear on. So if I come across to sort of DT's config file, if I can come through to where the main section was, I think I missed it, and let me just scroll up a bit. Yeah, you can see in DT's section here, he's actually got 3 separate xmobar configuration files launched, and you see here, this is the first monitor, the second monitor, and the third monitor. You know, it's a 0 index base, so that's how you launch multiple instances of xmobar across different screens, and these configuration files can be completely different for each desktop. So that's basically how we launch xmobar. Now, next bit here is we're using the EWMH and desktop config, which basically sort of set up xmonad to be a bit more desktop friendly. Now the next section is this sort of manage hooks, manage docs, manage hook desktop config, and this kind of syntax is kind of a bit sort of confusing when you first come to it, but we're sort of saying manage hooks equals this, and then apply it to the desktop config. You got this sort of kind of got to match, and then this is where we're sort of defining these sort of variables that we're going to use, like myStartupHook, my layout, the border width, the terminal, the mod mask, and down here is the configuration for the xmobar. And the other thing that you need to do is actually set additional keys, myKeys, down here, and that's going to let you use the easy configs additional keys set up, so you can sort of define your additional keys. Basically what I've done here is I can come across and compare the configuration file. So in DT's configuration file for launching xmobar, basically what he's done is put in the colors down here. What I've actually done is sort of removed the colors and replaced them with the variables, so they're all up here. So these sort of variables down here, I think it is, are actually, was it down there? Yeah, what I've actually used to set the colors in this section, apart from this one bit down here which I couldn't figure out, but that's how I'm setting the colors up here in the xmobar config. And again, we need to use the additional keys, myKeys, so that the myKeys easy config will actually work, because if you don't do that, the key bindings won't work and you're wondering what's going on. And basically this is just the help section down here that I've included from the default xmonad config file, and this basically gives you the keyboard shortcuts that are set up by default, so it just makes it easier to have those in your config file. If you're just starting out, it's just going to, it's going to be easier to remember. So the next thing is the actual xmobar config file, which is the bar we're using up here. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting the font to I can never pronounce it, but you know what, that font, the size, and what I'm doing is applying additional sort of hinting and anti-aliasing to the lettering. You can also set additional fonts down here as well, which I think you know, you might want to do as a backup kind of font. And then basically you can set the border color, the background color, the foreground color, the alpha transparency, the position, top or bottom. And these are kind of what control the sort of the offset between text. You can actually put icons in here, and DT has actually got a section coming into config file, I believe. I thought there was a section somewhere for somewhere he had some icons set up for his xmobar, but if you have a look around in his config files, I'm sure you'll sort of come across that. Let me go back to the xmobar. One of the important things that has to be specified is low on start true. I think this will sort of be in there by default if you copy the default xmobar configuration file. But the one thing that actually had me totally stumped for quite a long time was when I was actually let me come across back to his xmobar. This may just be different on systems or something, but when I first sort of copied some of this across starting up xmobar, what happened was I kept getting this thing saying updating, and it wasn't displaying any of the workspaces or anything. It was just displaying the time on the right. And what I found was that I had to run, I had to put in this section down here, must run stdin reader. Once I've done that there and there in the template and restarted xmonad, which by default is modq, that then suddenly stopped staying updating and actually displayed the workspaces properly, and the layout, the number of windows, and the currently selected window title. So that was one thing that I came across with setting up xmobar, was stdin reader. I think here in DT's config he's running an unsafe std stin standard in reader, and he's sort of got a template down here of different colors and stuff. And I think there was somewhere he had in his xmobar config a way to actually, yeah, you can see here, let's see, xmonad xpm, you can see this icon root thing here. I think basically this section here is going to pull in icons from this location. So if we come across to his xmonad config file, you can see is .files.xmonad config and xpm folder. So you can see the screenshot here of DT's. You can see it's got lots of icons, lots of pretty icons and stuff. And it looks like the way he's doing it is he's sort of got sort of these icons down here that basically sort of add the icons to xmobar, but I haven't sort of looked into how you do that as yet, because I'm not really bothered about icons and stuff. I just want the time. But that's basically looks like how you can actually set icons up in xmobar, is using those kind of these kind of xpm files, which I have no idea what they are, but that's basically how he's doing it. So that's sort of xmobar's sort of setup, and one of the things I've come across was having to run std, the standard in reader to actually get it to work. So that was one of the sort of issues that I'd sort of come across. So that's sort of some of the things I've come across switching from DWM to xmonad. Basically, just to sort of recap what we did, you need to, after obviously installing xmonad and xmonad contrib and xmobar, you probably also want to install dmenu, which is how you sort of launch applications. But by default, well, I'll show you the location of the config file. So xmonad tilde.xmonad is going to be in your home directory, and the default configuration file is xmonad.hs, and the location of the xmobar config is here, config xmobar c, and basically I think so what you can do is come across to shamelessly pilfering DT stuff, but if you come across to his config, you can see that these are named xmobar 0, 1, 2, 3, and he's basically using 3 separate instances of xmobar across 3 separate monitors. So you can actually have different xmobars for each different monitor, and they can each then display different stuff. So, you know, one might just display your network information, but you might not want that across all your displays. So you can have independent xmobar configurations for different screens. And again, basically, that was his config. But if I come across back into the main section, just show you how he was launching 3 separate instances in his main, and quite over here. So in the main section, he was actually launching 3 separate instances of xmobar across 3 different screens. So that's something that's possible, and so it's also possible to add icons in xmobar if you so wish, and this is the sort of xmonad documentation page. I've had sort of kind of a brief look over it, but basically all I've been doing is literally sort of copying and pasting bits of code in, seeing what works, trying to work out the sort of the syntax without knowing any Haskell. So I'll briefly go through this once again. Config desktop is something you want to install to make xmonad a bit more compatible with desktop applications. Then we had the this system IO, which I think was to do with xmobar. The spawn once and run, which are used to sort of like launch applications. The easy config for additional key bindings and mouse bindings. Again, dynamic log I think is to do with xmobar. Manage docs is from memory how we can set this to not how we can set windows so they don't overlap the xmobar or overwrite it if we want to. EWMH desktops is something I believe is required if you want to use OBS Studio with xmonad. And then you've got manage helpers to kind of determine sort of like I think it's kind of, you know, what kind of window it is. And we had this place, which I think was sort of like using you know, determining if it's, you know, if it's got gaps or smart windows. Copy window is what we're using to kind of emulate some of DWM's functionality in tagging a window across multiple workspaces. No borders is so we can set a window to not have a border in a particular layout. You can either use, I was using smart borders in my config. You can also use sort of the no borders library. When you sort of import these things, they these libraries, they then have kind of additional libraries. So you can just say like import the entire library, or just particular bits of that library. So no borders is what's allowing us to not have borders on full screen windows, and then spacing, obviously to have spacing between tiled or grid layouts, grid layout, and then resizeable tile to allow us to adjust the height of the stack windows. The config, how you change your mod mask, the default key used by xmonad, set your terminal. Again, I'm using it urxvt, and if you are, what you want to do is set it to urxvt-c, and then in your startup hook set it to urxvt-d and that will start the urxvt daemon and then use the urxvt client, and that will make it much faster you know, to open new terminals. And you know, as I said, I did try Alacrity or Alacrity, however you want to pronounce it, but the amount of CPU it uses is ridiculous. You open a new window of Alacrity and it's 2% of the CPU doing nothing, just opening a window. Free Windows 6% versus 0.2% with urxvt. So that's why I'm using urxvt. You can set the board width, again the width around the currently focused border, or well, windows with borders, and then you set the normal border color, which is an unfocused window, or the my focused or the window with focus border color. So that's how, for instance, in here you can see this has got focus, so it's got a blue border. The other window doesn't, so it just makes it easy to see which window has got focus, and by default it's going to have a 1 pixel border width, so I changed it to 2, but you know, you can change it to whatever you want. And this section down here was actually I think that's setting the colors of the xmobar. The workspaces is the amount of workspaces you're going to have and what you're going to call them, and you can, as I say, you can give them names if you want. The window count was basically again to do with DT's xmobar to actually to count the number of open windows and windows that have got applications, or windows that have got applications but aren't the current window. Again, down here, the startup hook, spawn your daemon, start your wallpaper. And again, down here we've got the layout, and the way I'm doing it, and say there may be other ways to do it. I see DT did a video about how you can toggle structs using a keyboard shortcut, but I basically just set mine up so that the first 3 layouts will be the full screen layout without a border and without padding. The next layout would be tiled with padding, followed by grid, and then a full screen window without any borders and without any spacing. And again, I was setting the tiled layout with 12 spacing, resizable tool, so that we can adjust the height of the stack windows. The grid, the spacing for the grid, monocle, which is the full screen mode, and we set that to have smart borders, so that these full screen layouts here and here don't have borders on them. The amount of windows by default in the master pane, the ratio, and the delta, which is the amount that the window will be resized when you hit the keyboard shortcut for that. The window rules, which I haven't quite got into or got figured out, for sort of like launching, you know, particular applications to have a particular size or behave in a particular way, float, not float. Things like MPV or picture-in-picture, which I haven't got figured out. Your myKeys, which is the easy config, and it's much easier than the default way of trying to set the key bindings. So what this will do is this will just let you add additional key bindings to the key bindings already set by default in xmonad, which are in the configuration file, and you can unset the default configuration files for particular key bindings as well if you want to. Then you kind of got your main section here, which is where you launch xmobar and kind of run through the main sort of loop of the program, and and then it picks up all the configuration variables that you set for, you know, that your startup hook, your layouts, your terminal, your border width, that stuff. And this again is DT's xmobar, which is you know, really nice in that it will basically show the currently selected window and workspaces that have a window on them but aren't currently focused, and also workspaces that don't have anything on them. And the most important thing down here is you need to set this additional keys P, myKeys, to get myKeys to work, so that you can sort of have your default key bindings. So that's a recap of the configuration file for xmonad and xmobar xc. So once you've kind of, it might be a good idea, as I said, to at least copy a base configuration file for xmobar and xmonad into the directories before you start up xmonad, because otherwise by default it's just a black screen. And the other thing that you needed to do was to actually edit your xinitrc file, and actually start xmonad. And I say this is how I start my, I set it to always start my shush agent when I start xmonad. So you find the location of xmonad by running where is xmonad, and it will then give you the location of the binary in your system, and you would put that into your xinitrc file. You then log out of your current, you know, window manager session. You'll be returned to, you know, your prompt, run startx, and you're going to start up in xmonad. And it would be a good idea before you start up to actually perhaps come across to the documentation and have a look at the some of this, you know, the FAQ, the wiki, guided tour. So the guided tour will sort of give you an overview of how the key bindings work by default, and sort of what they are, which will make it easier, you know, when you first start up xmonad in a new session without having used it before, you know, rather than blindly hitting keys to see what works. And so if you come across to YouTube and you actually search for xmonad, you'll see most of the videos about xmonad are actually on distrotube. There's a few others, but they're just not as good. They kind of don't tell you as much. There's DT's got several videos on using xmonad, switching to xmonad, getting started with xmonad, doing stuff like toggle struts. This is the video that he did explaining how to use a keyboard shortcut to toggle struts, which is the struts are what allow the window to override the xmobar status bar, so you can go full screen. Basically the way he's doing it is with keyboard shortcuts to toggle the toggle a particular window so it can go full screen or not. And the other thing he was sort of another couple of things he was mentioning was xmonad and name scratch pads. So that's how you can have like kind of sort of a Quake kind of drop down terminal sort of deal. So if you come across to YouTube and you search for xmonad, those are the videos you'd want to have a look at. I think this is the most recent, yeah, getting started with xmonad. And basically he goes and installs xmonad on Ubuntu, and if you're running Linux, I'd check that one out, because he'll actually give you the exact name of the packages that you need to install on Ubuntu, because I think by default the xmonad contrib package isn't called xmonad contrib. It's got a much longer, harder to remember name. So have a look at that one to get started on Linux and Ubuntu. but say I only switched about 3 days ago to using xmonad. But one other thing I should mention is a fundamental difference between xmonad and DWM. As you can see, as I switch these windows, they all have different layouts. With DWM, unless there's some patch you can add or something, by default, if you set a layout, it applies across all the workspaces. So if you set something full screen on workspace 1 and you go to workspace 2 with DWM, that workspace will be full screen as well, whereas with xmonad you can have totally different layouts on different workspaces. So you can see here I've got completely different layouts on different workspaces, which I don't think that by default DWM supports. The other thing, just go through some keyboard shortcuts, is to toggle, to cycle through the layout, use mod key and space. You can also do the mod key shift and space, and that returns you to the first layout. So if I just come back across to the layout section, the order of the layouts is going to determine how each new window is created. So if I was to swap tiled with monocle, every time I opened a new window it would be in tiled mode. So if you wanted to have grid by default, you'd put that first. So this order is going to determine the order of your layouts and how you cycle through them. So as you can see, I was cycling through monocle, tiled, grid, and then full screen. And if you press mod shift space, it's going to switch back to the first layout in your config. There's also a way to set up key bindings for switching to different layouts. I think it's called something like jump to layout. There's a way that you can define particular keys to jump to a particular layout. So like by default in DWM, it might be like Alt F or something to go full screen or something from memory. So you could set up similar key bindings to automatically switch to a particular layout rather than cycling through them. And the other thing is, the more layouts you have, the more you're going to have to cycle through. So if you're going to have lots of layouts, you might want to define keys to actually switch layouts rather than having to cycle through lots of them. So I think that's most of the things that I wanted to go over with the differences between DWM and xmonad. Another thing that I will mention is if I close some of these windows, let's just put some general stuff in here. Let's desktop. Okay. With DWM, when you sort of create a sort of if you're on the right side here on the stack and you create a new window, it'd come across here. But if I'm in xmonad and I create a new window in the stack, it actually appears above here. I can kill this window with shift mod C, but if I come across here to the master and then I create a new window, you can see it appears in the master. So if you're in the master layout and you launch a new window, it appears in the master. But if you're in the stack and you create a new window, it appears in the stack. And that's really nice behavior compared to DWM, because I found with DWM it's like constantly shifting sort of windows across. The other thing that I will mention about xmonad versus DWM is that focused, like sometimes when you're focusing stuff, if you have a floating window, in DWM it will have focus. So if you for instance, if you're in DWM and you have a floating video, yeah, what happens is when you switch to the next workspace, what happens is the floating window still has focus. So you go to type something, you know, in another window, and you actually the video still has focus. You're not actually typing. So with DWM, if you've got a floating window, every time you switch windows, you then have to kind of click on the screen so the thing you want to type on's got focus. And it's really, really irritating to have to constantly click to get focus away from the floating window. Whereas xmonad doesn't do that. If you've got a floating window in xmonad, the window behind it actually has focus. So you can have a floating video and actually be typing and switch to another screen and carry on typing, and it's not going to, the video is not going to sort of steal your keystrokes, and you think, what, nothing's happening, where's all my text? And then you suddenly realise that you've sped up the video or slowed it down or quit it or something because you're interacting with the video and not the window behind it. So that's another thing I've noticed about xmonad over DWM, which is something that made me sort of switch across. So that's sort of switching across from DWM to xmonad, and how I've sort of set stuff up after 3 days. And again, come across and search for distrotube gitlab. Distrotube gitlab. You see Derek Taylor GitLab come across to his dot files, and in the config directory is where the xmobar will be. In the xmonad you'll find, come across down here, that's his xmobar. That's his xmonad configuration file, and you can see this is adding icons for Haskell, so that's how he was adding icons to his xmobar config. So I'd recommend having a look at his stuff, and cross on the xmonad guided tour and documentation page. And I have I'll come across to my config. I come across to my dot files, config and xmonad, and so this is basically my xmobar and my xmonad configuration file. So if you want to use either of those as a starting place, you can use that to get started, and sort of gradually build on stuff. Might be easier than starting from scratch, or I found trying to edit the default configuration files for xmobar, xmonad and xmobar a bit tricky, so I actually sort of just started from a clean slate and just sort of gradually sort of added stuff in till I figured out what was working and what was not working, and the particular libraries that I wanted to import. So basically that's my configuration file for xmonad and xmobar, and some of the packages you might want to install to kind of emulate some of DWM's functionality, and to be able to tag a window for multiple workspaces. And as I said, there is xmonad copy window. This is the copy window library that I was using, which kind of provides DWM like tagging functionality, and basically these two bits of code here are what I was using to set copy a window to all windows and kill it. You can see that's the default style of writing keyboard shortcuts, but you want to use the easy config because it's a lot easier. And allegedly in this section here, which I haven't got to work, I think there may be this section here is something that will allow you to copy a window to a specific workspace rather than just all of them. But I think that may be this section, but I'm not totally sure. But I haven't figured out how to get that working yet, so I haven't figured out how to say, just tag, this window to appear on a particular workspace. At the moment, I've only got it set up to display on all workspaces at once, which might be useful if you're watching a video or something, but it'd be nice to have some more fine-grained control to just apply it to a particular workspace. But I think that's the library that provides that functionality. So that's something I need to look into, is how to set a window to appear on just a specific workspace, and also how to get picture-in-picture working so that it doesn't tile, that it will float by default. Because as I said, you can sort of, when a window's tiling, you can sort of use the mouse to click on it and, right click on it and resize it. But I think you probably want to define a keyboard shortcut to do that. So it'd be nice if there was a way to kind of float a window and have it automatically resized so that the video didn't have massive black bars occupying half the screen. It would just come up in the top right or top left or something. But that's something to look into. But overall, I'd say xmonad, doing the configs perhaps not as easy as something like i3 or DWM. There's a bit more kind of effort involved, but it's much more flexible in that you can have different layouts and different workspaces, and there's no recompiling, no patching with like DWM. Which is a real problem. And the other issue is it's not just you got to patch stuff, but what happens is when a new version of DWM comes out, if you're you either have to kind of merge the changes back into your version, or basically download the new version and apply all your settings again and then recompile it. The other issue is having config files means that if I want to copy my xmonad config to another machine, I just have to copy the config files across. With DWM, you're going to have to not only copy the config files across and everything, you're going to have to rebuild it, recompile it on every machine you want to install it on, which is just silly. So xmonad does take a bit more setup out of the box. It's not as intuitive and easy to get into as something like i3. But it's a lot more sort of powerful and flexible in what you can do. So I think it's a much better program than DWM, which I had several issues with. The main one was like when I was switching windows, it would sometimes I'd switch windows and sometimes it'd show half this window and half the next window and kind of really slow down. Which is strange because it's supposed to be really lightweight and suckless, but I found it really kind of a bit glitchy. So have a look at xmonad, come across to YouTube, search for xmonad, have a look at all the distrotube videos on xmonad, because when you do a search you'll find most of them are by DT. Have a look at his config files and shamelessly steal them, as I have done. So that's getting started on xmonad if you're just switching across from DWM or i3.